Today I'm going to be interviewing Aidan Wachter. Hi, Aidan, how are you?
I'm very good. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you on the show, actually. Yours is a voice I've heard quite a lot, but never put a face to the voice, so it's nice. So, traditional first question, what do you do?
I am a jack of a few trades, I guess. Currently, what I am doing, if we go into the classical question is now, which is usually what you do is for a living, is I'm a writer. For the past 7 years, up until I kind of shifted full-time to writing, I was a talismanic jeweler. And then before that, tons of just your basic jobs, lots of retail management, everything from bookstores to lumber yards to some facilities management, things like that. But I didn't really kind of branch out into what I would think it was kind of what really is my thing as a public work thing until about 7 or 8 years ago. And then kind of what sits behind that all is a lifetime interest in magic.
That's interesting. Interesting response to that first question. Obviously, there is, and you know, what I've sort of noticed with people that are involved in sort of magical thinking is that there's a lifetime stacked behind there somewhere of events, and you know, so let's take it back to sort of early days. When did you first get, you know, involved, or you realised that you sort of saw the world slightly differently, maybe? I'm making an assumption here, but
yeah, that's a reasonable assumption, though. I knew that I was essentially a total freak around everybody that I knew at a really early age, and I remember as that kind of became more clear, like there was a point where I think there's a point where you're young enough that the adults around you just kind of put up with the fact that you're weird, and they figure it's a phase, and then that shut off. There's a point where people are like no longer wanting to hear you talk about these things.
okay.
And they were hostile to it. My parents were just not open-minded about it. And so I think I knew pretty early on that I was very different, and I could tell pretty early on that I wasn't interested in what I saw adults doing, the adults that I knew. And then that really, I think that concretized somewhere around 10 years old or 11 years old, that it was at that point that I was like, I'm not doing what is kind of set out. I'm not interested. And I didn't know what I would do or really what my, yeah, I knew what my issues were, that it just seemed like this explanation of the world that I'm being given doesn't make any sense, which was very middle California, suburban middle class. My father was in very large scale construction, procurement manager for one of the people that built one of the companies that built airports and things like that, nuclear power stations. And my mother was in real estate. Yeah, I knew that what they were doing didn't make any sense to me, and kind of how they appeared to see the world didn't make sense to me.
So was it, when you were growing up then, were there sort of events in your early childhood that made you see the world differently, or was it just that
I had a bunch of, my first memory is a hallucination, which I understand from asking about it when I was young, was probably when I was around 3. And I was extremely ill from pneumonia. I had pneumonia a few times quite badly when I was young, really young, 1 to 4, I think, is really the period of lots of pneumonia. And so I have a clear vision of being on my back and looking at the ceiling and seeing kind of circus animals doing their thing and not being immersed in it. It's not like I thought I was in the circus, right? It's like,
Yeah.
no, I'm in my room, I'm on my back, I'm really don't feel good. And there's these creatures up here doing stuff.
Yeah.
And then later that moved into a lot of, I was very, very heavily nightmare ridden. I didn't tend to have good dreams.
Right.
Which eventually moved into a lot of sleep paralysis,
Oh, right.
years of very frequent sleep paralysis. And within those dreams, there were kind of recurring themes. Sometimes there were recurring characters, and I didn't really have a sense of what they were. But like I've mentioned this in other podcasts, and I think it's in my first book, that one of the things that I experienced was like this is very TV vision of kind of a Native American kind of warrior guy with feathers in his hair and a bow and arrow. But he was two-dimensional. And so if he turned sideways, if he turned straight on, I couldn't see him anymore.
Wow.
And so it was quite difficult to navigate.
Yes.
And there were a couple of things like that were, those were not outright terrifying, but they were kind of menacing. And it's like, now I kind of go, okay, something was trying to get my attention and my child mind was putting a shape to it.
Yeah.
But I really didn't have any idea what that was until I was 11. And I know that when I was 11, and by that time I'd gotten heavily into science fiction, primarily Michael Moorcock, due to, I was into, Lord of the Rings and stuff.
Yeah.
I'd read that stuff by that point. And then either my brother, who's a little older, or my parents bought me this fantasy calendar by someone that you would know because you're on the island, of Rodney Matthews. And it was all illustrations of Michael Moorcock stuff. And so once I realized these were pictures from books, I asked that for my birthday that year, which is in February, so just after Christmas, for all the Michael Moorcock books I could find names for. And they actually found me dozens of them and gave me this huge pile. And that introduced me to a science fiction and fantasy bookstore in Berkeley, California, which was 30 miles from where we were, that I began visiting to buy books. And so my first really concrete kind of, no doubt now, though at the time it was just terrifying, vision of that was kind of clearly magical was Dark Carnival was 2 floors, and it was a beautiful little rat maze of a too tight bookstore, So you'd kind of get up into a space and grab what you wanted to look at and sit on the floor. There was nothing else you could do in there. And so I was upstairs in a dream looking at books in Dark Carnival one night, and felt this kind of like cold presence. And I looked up, and it was this male figure in an all black suit, black tie, black hair kind of slicked back, longish hair, black beard, and then fully black eyes, no whites, no pupils, just fully black, who was just kind of blasting this kind of cold force at me. And it was absolutely terrifying. And that went on just for a few moments, and then I woke up. But it was totally I think it was probably the first time I had a completely like crystal clear, never went away vision of anything that happened to happen in a dream. And then I didn't know what that was at the time, but I could retrospectively tag kind of the rest of my life after that point to that moment.
So here's a question for you, because from my own experience, there's something that I'll relay in a minute. What was your parents' sort of response to that? Did you tell them about it, and what did they?
I think I didn't tell them about that dream.
Right.
I think by that time I didn't trust them with that kind of information. It's things had gotten very we were never estranged specifically, but there was a point where I realized that they didn't get what was going on and they didn't know how to deal with it.
Right.
And that it's not like I would get punished for sharing it, but there was just no point.
Interesting.
Like I had it together enough to go, I'm not getting any help from that quarter. So there's no reason to share that.
See, the reason why I'm asking this is because obviously I think, I've spent many years teaching music, and often to very young children. And the very young children, and I've also had 4 children of my own, and obviously at the early part of their life, they are still sort of dreaming when they're awake, if you see what I mean. They have a sort of a consciousness that sort of sits somewhere between waking dream state and what we would term as reality, like a reality consciousness type of thing.
Absolutely.
For quite some time. And normally when children share that type of thing with parents, it's normally sort of, it's just your imagination type of response, and I think for most people that just becomes, they disregard it as they get older. So what was interesting for me with this, asking you that question, is obviously that didn't happen for you. You became more suspicious about what, like your experiences were real to you, and you weren't willing to disregard them because you were told by your parents not to, type of thing. Maybe I'm just sort of guessing here.
No, I think that's very accurate. I think, like I said, I'd started questioning that. It's not that I'd questioned, I would say, but that the world that was presented to me by the adults and then by the kids that were better adjusted than I was and fit in better or were able to pretend that better than I was, it wasn't interesting.
No.
It was like, why would you choose? Because to me, it seemed like a choice that they had made to perceive and then operate in the world this way that is clearly giving you nothing. To me, it gave them something, I'm sure, but it just didn't make sense. And then I think there's a blessing to, the kind of fantasy stuff more than the science fiction stuff, though some science fiction contains that, in that there was the idea that there was kind of secret knowledge, right? That there was kind of secret ways of being,
yes.
And that maybe that wasn't always safe to share, right? These are kind of common threads in folklore that then made it into the fantasy canon, I would say. And so I think all of that stuff was present. Like, it gave me some guideline that, like, okay, if I think this is real, I have to kind of protect it. I have to kind of protect this vision until I find somebody, if I ever do, that I could share it with.
That's an interesting sort of point. So this, you mentioned about the age of about 11 or so, where you had, you already pretty much formed something that you could sort of say, well, I'm not going to say you're fully formed at this point, but there is a trajectory that's sort of there somehow, or seemingly. So what happens next then?
For me, I was definitely a peculiar kid, and I was already pretty research heavy at that point. So if there were things I was interested in, I would go to the library and kind of research them. And one of the things that I was interested in, so this would have been 77, 78, so between 10 and 11, was what I could now say was like kind of psychedelic culture, but was specifically kind of just drug culture to me. I didn't have a distinction there yet. And so I began kind of like going, okay, maybe that is a way in. Maybe there's something here that, and this would have been, kind of, so I was born in 67. That's when Surrealistic Pillow I was born on the day Surrealistic Pillow came out by the Jefferson Airplane, which I always say is, that's my sign, the Surrealistic Pillow. And we were close to the Bay Area. That was decidedly not my family's scene. But, and so I do think that I had a sense of all that stuff going on. And I had a pretty hardcore interest in it, and it was a very conscious interest. So it's a funny one when people go, oh, you fell into this drug use when you were young. It's like, no, I hunted it down. I didn't fall into anything. And so I got interested in that and was able to kind of figure out how to source weed at what was then really young, though it isn't now. That's much more common now. That was an interest. And I got heavily into music. Through that Michael Moorcock connection, I was into Hawkwind before I ever could hear them where I was. And so I think I was probably 13 when I found Hall of the Mountain Grill as the first of their records. It was like, okay, these people have something going on, you know, and there were other things like that. But whereas friends of mine were way deeper into Pink Floyd or Black Sabbath or something, I was always a Hawkwind kid. You know, as I got older, up into my teens, then I actually was able to find things like actual psychedelics and played with that pretty heavily. But again, it was still not, it wasn't the thing. It's like, it was doing something in that it was helping me to see that like perception is so mutable. And maybe that's what's wrong with all these people, right? Is that their perception is locked on something that doesn't make sense to me and mine isn't. And so, you know, and I got signs of that even in those kind of early teen psychedelic things of, I would do mushrooms or LSD with friends who would just have these wild trips. And for me, they were very subtle. Like the effects were incredibly subtle for a very long time. Like, do I feel anything different, right? And this should have been a key, but I didn't know enough to know that this was a key. I had to like learn how to feel that experience in some way. And I don't know, well, I know that I got very early on, I was a bookstore kid. I left school at 15 and started working in bookstores. And I know I picked up Starhawk's The Spiral Dance, which I think was 79 or 80 maybe, is when it came out. And then that first book actually on runes as divination, that Ralph Bloom's Book of Runes with the little ceramic kind of rune set, came out, I think, in 82. And then that was kind of, that got me playing in that stuff and got me looking at things like the Norse sagas. And I think and it was in 82 as well. So again, I'm 15 at that point, that I met some folks that were into industrial music, that were a few years older than me. And they turned me on to Psychic TV's first record, Force the Hand of Chance. And that was a very strange album. It probably still is a very strange album. It's one of those that probably hasn't unstranged too much. And one of the things that was in there is it said, you know, if you send us 15 pounds and 2 international reply coupons or whatever, we will send you the Gray Book, which is how you get information about the Temple of Psychic Youth. So a friend of mine who was also interested in all the weird stuff, though, he went the other direction. He's now a fundamentalist, religious person. But we contacted the temple and got the Gray Book. And so that was the first kind of like, this is an understandable operative piece of magic that is talking about things that I don't know they're thinking the same way I am, but I know they're not thinking like the people I am not thinking like, right? Kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. And that led me to trying to read Crowley, which didn't really work. I didn't gel with him at that time. Well, I didn't gel with him at any time really, but that was enough there. And I think I didn't mention it, but my dad had the early Castaneda books.
Oh, right.
First
Oh,
three,
okay.
I think, were in the
No, you
house.
didn't mention that, but that makes a lot of.
And that is the thing that made sense. And that was, I realized later, was kind of the filter.
Yeah.
Like this very peculiar worldview that is very animistic, very spirit ridden, there's all this stuff going on just behind the scenes, right? I think that informed how I looked at the more Western witchcraft and ceremonial magic that I was looking at and going, this isn't this kind of pagan and ceremonial magic isn't quite got the vibe that made sense to me. And that now we know largely made up, but based on a lot of different kind of what we would call shamanic cultures now, stuff coming out of Castaneda and psychedelic stuff, that made way more sense. And so I think I was probably always looking for the balance in there, but it took me a number of years to kind of find that.
There's lots of things there. Let's. I was interested by the fact that your dad had those books. Because I was wondering whether there was something, that's why I asked you the question about your parents' responses to those things, that maybe you weren't being shut down in the way that kids normally do. That's what was in the back of my mind. I'm just sort of suggesting that maybe your dad had an interest in something that perhaps he didn't let on too much.
My parents, I believe, had an interest in some things and then they rejected them pretty soundly. My father was always very interested. He just passed in March.
Oh, okay.
But he was always very interested in Native American culture. There were family connections to that, though we aren't Native, but my family, his side of the family was very, very rural, backwoods Idaho folks, and they had a lot of so like I remember when I would go out to that part of the country and would meet friends of my grandparents. One of my grandmother's best friends was married to a Native man, and this, they would have been probably in their 80s at that point. So this was not, and so I think he always had that. We had some, and so I think that's probably where the Castaneda thing came from.
Right.
And he was always very interested, but not for himself, I think,
right,
in some things. And then he later kind of, I would say, kind of calcified into a very materialist view.
Right.
He ended up very aggressively kind of what we think of kind of the typical modern atheist anti-religious stance. And I don't think he was exposed to enough of kind of alternative religious things to not lump everything in the same category. So I always appreciated him, that he was really upfront. Like, I think what you're into is a crock. But he wasn't like trying to get me to not do it. He just thought it was bullshit.
Okay. That's interesting.
And then my mom, I know, was involved with there's a Rajneesh connection in my family through her brother.
Right.
This is, he went out and spent time at the ashram in Pune and came back, oranged up and bearded and all that.
Okay.
And through that, they did, it was a sannyasin run class on psychic development. And I was always deeply perturbed by what happened, because my mom clearly was talented at psychometry and it freaked her out and she never looked back. But I was like, what's wrong with you? But there were a lot of ways that they were open. It wasn't, but there were definitely things that, definitely all the drug use stuff as well, that there were definitely interests that I did not share with them. But I did go through, they did let me take an offshoot of an EST training when I was 15. So they weren't at that time closed down entirely, but it was still a little different than where my head was going. Like, that was a hugely beneficial thing to me, to be in this room and go, oh, okay, this is what this looks like on the 25 to 60-year-olds as they're trying to process this stuff.
I'm always, I'm intrigued by the responses that happen with people who you can go, they're quite square people, and then they get something that sort of bounces into their worldview that they can't process. And I've seen, there's, in fact, it was Ramsey Duke's Lionel Snell's book, where he was talking about somebody who, under hypnosis, just like they had a medical hypnotist, but he came into, I think it was Oxford or Cambridge, wherever he was, and he did this stage hypnotism type thing, and the responses to the people who are obviously very rational thinking people under hypnosis, the person next to him was made to disappear, and when he was asked, well, where's John gone, he said, well, he's gone out, but he was obviously still sitting there. And then he made John come back, and he said, where is John? Oh, John's come back. And then he made half of John disappear. And of course, this guy then virtually went into some sort of meltdown because he couldn't deal with the fact that this was not what he could comprehend,
Absolutely.
And he explains this like, if you take this like mathematics and change one of the numbers, and he shows by adding numbers together that the whole of the system of mathematics falls apart. And it's sort of like the process that our worldview, once you start to tinker with the edges of it, you either go full blown, the world collapses around you, or you do something to stop that happening. So I see this when I do, again, I spoke to you about cut up, which I use to teach people to, explore creative things, write lyrics or whatever. And I always have to sort of say to particularly adults, this is a thought experiment. Because once you could hang something on that, they could go, oh yeah, okay, it's a thought experiment. This is not real type of thing. And that way you could sort of slip things under the radar.
Absolutely.
But what will happen if you don't do that? They start coming up with reasons why this works logically. And you go, well, whatever's going on, we don't really know. But it's almost like you get this kickback. You don't get this with kids, you get this with adults.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what happens, so like with your mother, she obviously had a skill at being able to, what does this object belong to? Who does it belong to? As soon as she starts to think, oh my goodness, there might be this, okay, and push that out. We don't want to try to work out why I got that right, or whatever.
Yeah. So
I'm sort of intrigued by this and how we have arrived at that point, because kids don't do this, in my experience,
Right. Well, it's an interesting one. I remember, it was, again, 15 was a wild time, but I flew down to, my parents allowed me to fly down to Southern California to visit a friend of mine that I knew in high school who had moved down to Huntington Beach. And I stayed with him, and I was extremely disturbing to his mother by this time. Probably 15 is where I was kind of coming into my own as to who I was going to be. And the point that she actually was like, he can't be here, was they had some friends over, and they had a young kid. I don't remember how old he was, but little kid. And he was drawing, and he was drawing a squirrel. And the adults were trying to get him to draw it in brown, right? And I was trying to be very polite about it. I wasn't being hostile about it to them at all, but I was like, what if he's perceiving something that is just, that you perceive that as really clearly a brown, and he's perceiving that color, it's purple. It's not, is that actually an issue or whatever? And they found this very disturbing. And after that, I was persona non grata in the house, which I thought was fascinating. But it was that thing. It's like, I think we do that all the time, right? You go, no, we're going to teach you how to see how you're supposed to see in this culture. And this is one of I got some massive blowback on parts from people privately, mostly, for some of what's in my book, Weaving Fate, talking about that. as they're like saying, yeah, but this is how we have kind of an agreement on reality. And I'm like, but how well is that working for everyone involved, right? I understand that's what it does. That's specifically what I address there, is that this is part of the function of culture, is to constrain vision. And it's not always a negative thing, but that is clearly what it's for. You know, and so I think all that stuff is quite fascinating. And yeah, in my parents' case, I think, yeah, I think it was the door opened too easily, too wide, and they didn't have, I don't think that they had really questioned before that. So had they questioned more before that, or had more experiences like what I had had coming up, then that might have been intriguing rather than terrifying. But I've seen this a lot with people. When I taught Magic Live, you know, we had a IoT temple that for a while in the late 80s, I guess it is, early 90s. I guess early 90s for IoT. And we would have people come through on kind of open working days. It was very interesting to see who kind of, the experiences of what we were doing would either produce kind of like a massive anxiety experience or like massive relief.
Yeah.
And often it didn't really matter how intense the thing was.
No.
It was just that, like, because we were the only kind of, I think, we were the only open advertising working temple that we would come in and teach invocation. We'll talk about it for an hour. We'll have a 15-minute break where anybody who doesn't want to be here for the working part can bail out without question, and then we'll go into the temple and do stuff. And sometimes it was intense and sometimes it wasn't. But it also showed me, yeah, that you'd see the snapshot. They're like, oh, thank God. These are some other people that actually have had some of this experience and know how to do something with it. Like there is some grasp in there. And then it was also very interesting to see what became my entertainment there, both within our temple itself and then those public groups, is I would kind of go around afterwards and ask people, like, can you tell me what you experienced? Because I was having very, very different experiences from everybody else. But it also just showed me how different that, you know, whether it's a conditioned thing or it's kind of which way does the protective influence go, right? Does the protective, is the protection by allowing it in or by kicking it out, right? Because I think it's a protective response in both ways. It's a defensive response, but on one side you're going, yes, that's what I need to feel secure, is to know this is real.
Yeah.
And what I need to feel secure is to not know that this is real. It's the same impulse going in two different directions.
Well, that's a very good point, actually. That's a very interesting point. Because again, if you think that it's always that, you know, it's always, that's too frightening, that sort of thing. That's almost, again, a very rationalist way of thinking about a response. That a response, it could be the same thing, even though it's viewed as completely the opposite, whether somebody finds it frightening or whether somebody can actually accept it.
Right. It's very interesting, and this is, you know, jumping way forward, but one of the things that I've had recurring experiences in dreams and in trance is kind of what I know from study, though I had them before, is kind of this traditional thing that we get out of, again, kind of shamanic culture, using that in a broad sense, not in a specific, you know, Tungus sense, of kind of having the spirits or allies kind of dismember you and take you apart and kill you, boil you, do whatever, and then put you back together, right? And this is something I've experienced more than once with different allies. And one of the things that I had never asked, and it came up in conversation with a good friend of mine who's closer to my experience than many people, as I said, have you had this experience? And he said, yeah, totally. I said, did you find it frightening? And he said, no. I said, oh, cool, because everybody that I've ever talked to talks about it as being this terrifying thing, which was never my experience. Like, I found it fascinating. This doesn't mean that it was pleasant,
no,
but there wasn't this fear response to it. It's like, okay, yeah, I trust you, and that you have my best interest at mind as my allies. And so I trust that the work that you're doing is to my benefit. So why would I be afraid, even if it's not fun, right?
Yes.
And I think that ties into that same thing.
Yeah, I think there is that sort of thing of allowing. Well, there's I don't know where I first heard this. Probably the I Ching. It's this sort of. It's not a case of whether you believe or disbelieve. It's just suspending your disbelief, being able to park yourself in a space in between whether you think something is this or think something's that, and just allowing it to be what it is. And I think maybe there's an element of that, of just going with that in that moment of, and again, I see this with from a creative point of view, that you sort of do that. You get an idea and you don't try to evaluate, is it a good idea or is it a bad idea necessarily? You just go with that
Right.
until it sort of speaks to you somehow. And then maybe later on you can work out whether that is of value to you or not. But in that moment, you sort of have to ride that thought.
And I think that's a really big piece of both, if we can call it really broadly, art and magic.
Yeah.
And that's to me, that's the piece that I get some abuse for kind of being really solidly on the somewhat irrational side of things, and not saying you need to know, and not saying that you need to test, and not saying that you need to be certain, or that it has to be historically valid, or that it has to be acceptable on any level. And there's a lot of folks that don't like that at all.
Right.
But I do see it. It's very much like, when I play some form of music that I don't know what it is, using kind of how I started doing the electric music that I do is going, okay, I don't really know music per se. I know what I like the sound of, but I don't know the names of the chords. I don't know scales. I don't know keys. I don't know that stuff. But since I have this computer, could I view my guitar as a way of generating sounds like an industrial musician might have with an emulator, right? And to do that process that way is all about kind of trusting that process, that you go in and go, okay, I'm just gonna see, let's track these. Do these things go together? Oh, this is better than that one. And you end up with something that, for me at least, works as both magic and music. And this is very much my practice with magic. Operates that same way, that it's not based on kind of a very rationalist view. My biggest, it's the point that I always take with Crowley, and why Crowley and I don't get along, is his definition, his description for the equinox, right, was the method of science, the aim of religion. And I'm like, no, neither. No, it's art and spirit. Yes, there's an aspect of empiricism, but purely just on a willingness to play, and go, okay, I'm going to do this because it feels like it should work. And if I can do that enough, then, at least in my experience, for everyone that I know that kind of operates in a similar phase, is what happens is you discover, like, you can trust that. You can go in and go, rather than here are the rules for doing a sigil or doing a talisman, I could just decide now this is the thing I need help with, and become creative. And as you said, you kind of wait and you play and you are open and you don't reject. And you allow yourself to do stuff that dead ends, and you laugh about it instead of throwing it across the room. And you do this process until something clicks and you go, oh, this is lively now. This is something. And it's not necessarily something that's super describable, because that's this high intellect, high consciousness rationalist side. Whereas to me, if we kind of like trust what Jan Fries refers to as the deep mind, and I think off of as kind of like the animal mind or the animal body, it knows all this stuff. We know all this stuff, but it doesn't really fit in our kind of materialist construct. And so if we can find any way to break out of that, and art is one of the great ones, that is, interestingly, there's a perceived hurdle there, just like in magic, right? that there's so much you need to know before you can play. You got to know the rules before you can break the rules, right? It
Yeah,
exists in both things. They're incredibly similar, if not the
yeah,
same in
that's right.
many cases.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I sort of take the Alan Moore sort of perspective that art is magic and magic
Yeah.
art type of thing. And they do operate in very, very similar ways. And one of the things, if you think about exploring a creative line, it's a bit like going up into the attic and having a look at all the stuff that's up there. You look at the first bit that comes out of the box, and you think, and eventually, if you keep digging, you'll find a gem. The sort of consciousness and creative processes are like that, and that's why you need to keep going with an idea without evaluating it, because somewhere along the line, somewhere on that journey, is the thing that that's of value, basically, or whatever.
Absolutely.
It's meant to be the thing that you're supposed to find. Let's put it that way. And you can't do that rationally. You could have a couple of ideas, like if you want to get started with you want to start writing your book or whatever, you can create a framework. I'm going to sit down for an hour in the morning and blah blah blah. But that's it. It's almost like saying, well, I'm going to go on a pilgrimage and now I'm going to start walking, type of thing. But you don't know what you're going to experience, and you don't know how long it's going to take you to get there, and all the rest of it. And again, this goes so much against how we're being trained, with education, and how you can paint, or how you can play a guitar or whatever it is.
It's very interesting. I think the analogy that I use a lot is it's very much like driving a car, right? That you can sit in the car with your maps and try and work everything out perfectly, but everything changes once you get on the road. And the best way to get where you're going, again, is to have a general direction and just start, because you always can turn the wheel. You can always go around the block and head in a different direction, but you got to be moving for that to happen. And that's, I think, the biggest downside of kind of the wonder of the information age, is there's so much information that I think it stops so many people, because they believe they have to assimilate and understand and fully grasp so much information before they can begin.
Yeah.
And so I feel really, probably the luckiest thing that happened to me as a practitioner was growing up out in this dead suburb, because I didn't have any source of information. Had I even been in the city, I would have been able to go to one of the candle shops or something and find some books. I had the local shopping mall, which did not have much in the way of these things. And so it forced me to actually start experimenting rather than start studying. And I think that's been hugely beneficial.
I think that is one of the key things. Limited amounts of information that you spend a lot of time with, whether that's, I've interviewed a lot of musicians who are slightly older than me and contemporary with me, who, when you started off, you couldn't get the music books because they didn't exist. You had to, in this country, you had to find somebody who was in the Merchant Navy to bring in a record from America, so that you could listen to what Muddy Waters was doing and all the rest of it. So that meant to say you had to live in a port city, whether that was London or Liverpool or Southampton or whatever, Bristol. And you sort of, and the other classic one was maybe one person in the road had a television. Back in the early days, and late 50s, early 60s. And it was a case of, well, when Lonnie Donegan or whoever it was, Elvis Presley was on the TV, you had to find out what he was on and all go around this person's house to sit around and see what was going on, So totally. This limited amount of information. And again, from a magical practice point of view, if you've got just that thing and you think, well, this might work, there's some story from a folk tale. And I grew up in Cornwall, so there was a lot of stuff going on down there. But it was all like hearsay, that one of the kids said, "Oh, my mum said so and so," that if you did this at this not particular night of the year, blah blah blah, that type of thing. So it was there in sort of general sort of stuff, but it wasn't like you had books on it. It's just
Right.
it's just an idea, and you could play with that idea. And I think that's an important thing. Otherwise, you just drown in a sea of information, which is where we are.
Yeah, and I think, for me, the other thing that I talk about magic a lot with the folks that are playing with kind of my stuff, because they tend to want to diverge and go into information thing, which is really not the goal. It's like, no, they're practices, and just practice them and then modify them. And don't go looking for permission to modify them from me or anybody else. Just start, just do it. And I think the best analogy that I have for kind of my take on magical practice, whether that be how I did jewelry or doing the talismanic work or how I do sigil magic or anything else, is to me, it's very much like blues, right? You go, this is an incredibly basic thing. There's not a lot of inherent complexity.
No.
And we can go back to the earliest recordings we have, and we can go to Robert Johnson, Sun House, Sun Seals, or Lightning Hopkins, onward into all of the strange places where we move it into Pink Floyd, we move it into the Stones, we move it into Zeppelin, we move it into AC/DC and Motorhead. We move it still in there in Bonnie Raitt, into on and on and on, and we end up in this place of, kind of favorites of mine is like Ray Wiley Hubbard, most primitive version of that in general, fabulous stuff, I think, out of Texas, or Gary Clark Jr., who's kind of the most gorgeous player, I think, right now. And you go, there's not this massive information density that is feeding into that.
That's right.
It's just time and feeling into what that reality is for you, right? And I see magic as at least it can be the same. I'm not here to say it is any one way, but I think that there's been so much emphasis on kind of study. And even though the people that were originally doing that were, again, the Golden Dawn clearly had to practice because they didn't have anything else to do. They had no television. They were translating the books. This is a bunch of folklore society people, so it's informed by that. But then at some point it becomes, no, we have to try and learn everything that there is to learn before we begin. And I think it's the most common mistake in any kind of creative endeavor.
Yeah, I agree with you. Going back to the blues.
Yeah.
Of course, the interesting thing about the blues is it's deeply magical anyway, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that sort of cracks me up about, kids coming along going, oh, so we did our, key stage, whatever it is at school, and we did the blues. And you think, oh, yeah. And of course, what they're being taught has got nothing to do with the blues, really. It's,
right.
It's all about sort of structure that's not really, it could be anything. Blues could be one chord and, whatever. But it's the fact that once you start to point that out to them, what's going on and how you're being sort of bewitched by the way that these lyrics work, and whatever Muddy Waters is getting up to when he's telling you his story, or John Lee Hooker or whatever, and you think, well, and of course, if you put that back in context to where the blues was coming from, where they were coming from, there was a vibrant magical culture there that just was there.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely,
there it is, and it comes out in the music.
Well, and I think that it is interesting, because to me, I kind of see, thinking about it that way, yeah, there's kind of like two primary streams that are active now, I would say, that are of interest to me at least, which is that we have the stuff that came out of the folklore societies, right, which is your Golden Dawn, a lot of the neo-pagan stuff.
Yeah.
Came out of folklorists then seeing what they could turn in. And then we have this very living side of it, in America at least, which came from the blues, hoodoo conjure, New Orleans voodoo, all of those things. And it's such an interesting view. It's, to me, it's I've never cared about virtuosity and the Yngwie Malmsteen.
No.
Right. Unlistenable to me, it's no hate on it. I've got great friends that love that stuff. But it's, I think, what got me with Hawkwind. It's what got me with Lightning Hopkins. It's what got me with John Lee Hooker in particular, is that there's a current there that you can feel.
Yeah.
And that is blues. And it's the same thing to me, is that's how, to me, magic feels. And that's what I think I got. It's kind of the blessing, I think, of falling into the Castaneda stuff early, was like there was a feel there.
Yeah.
And the feel is something that I always tap into, and it's the thing I'm always hunting. And it's very difficult for folks now. The folks that I find to have the most difficulty with the stuff that I'm trying to do is there's not a lot of certainty in it, in the stuff that I publish. It's very exploratory. It's not prescribed. There's not really a wrong way to do anything. And a lot of folks get so jammed up now because it's like, it's that thing, is it's like, if there's any kind of message to that, it's the same thing as with music, because it's like the feel is the only thing that's going to guide you.
Yes.
And so you have to find a way into that. And if you find a way into that, you've found all the ways into that. And that's, I think, kind of the beauty of music to me, as well, as I think that for me, a lot of that probably came from that, because I did find magic kind of because of art, because of music, because of novels. I found it through these creative practices rather than rigorous study or academia. It's I'm glad retrospectively that I had the sense to go, I shouldn't do another 3.5 years of high school if they'll let me test out, and I tested out and went to work. And there are downsides from that, but I don't think any of those are tied into like my creative side or my magical side. I think I got out while the getting was good. And again, not saying that should be anyone's path. It was just correct for me. And so, yeah, there's a great book, it's the first book that's qualified as surf noir by a guy named Kem Nunn, called Tapping the Source.
Okay.
And I've loved the title of that book, because that was what, it's a surfboard company in the book is called Tapping the Source. And to me, that is that same kind of concept of, if you want to move through the water, or if you want to move through music, or if you want to move through art, that has to be the key. It's not an intellectual process. Your intellect is involved, obviously. You can't separate out the brain from the body, but the actual kind of 2 + 2 = 4 every time when you're moving into creative spaces, that's not the right answer.
No.
It's just not, because then you miss all of the kind of amazing potential for beauty that exists in all these things.
Yeah. In fact, that's a really good analogy, surfing, really, to those processes. Let me take you back to, because you mentioned about the IoT.
Yeah.
Which came in from nowhere. So there's a bit of a journey then between the IoT and what you're doing with the jewelry, talismanic jewelry, and then the books. So what? Just sort of give me a little bit of a drift on how that journey went.
Yeah, what happened for me was I'd moved from where we were outside of the Bay Area, and then I lived in either Santa Cruz Mountains for a while, which is where I met the second IoT member or OTO member that I ever met. And through him, I joined the OTO. And then we moved up to the Berkeley-Oakland border. And a friend of mine, the first OTO member that I met, was by that time lodge master of an OTO lodge.
Right.
And so I joined that lodge. But it was always very weird. And I loved a ton of those people. I loved my time there, but Crowley and I are not a match. Ceremonial magic and I are not a match. And lodge structure and I are not a match. So it was but it was the first place that I got to spend a lot of time around other people that were at least taking magic seriously. And I did better with them than I did with the local pagan groups, which were very, what we would now say more LARPing or cosplay, as I saw it.
Yeah.
which it was a lot of dress up, a lot more pageantry, and not a lot of active magic. It was celebratory.
Yeah.
Traditional Wicca is, for the most part, is what we would say. What I would say.
Yeah.
But I did find some good things in all of those places, and I made good friends in all of those places.
Yeah.
And I found a poster for an IoT gathering, and hooked up with them. And I knew the IoT because that was the first, Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut was the first book that actually was truly useful to me.
Yeah.
I didn't do a lot of what he suggested as he suggested it, but it gave me kind of a framework to look at other magical systems. And that was its benefit to me. And so I joined up with that temple, and kind of clashed with the guy who ran it energetically. It was his temple. I wasn't going to have any issue with him. But so I got my initiation there, and there was to be a US section meeting in San Francisco. And I was living in San Francisco at the time. And I was like, absolutely, I'm in on that. And the day before, the guys that were that had initiated me said that their temple and the temple that had initiated them in had all left the IoT for various reasons. And that it was obviously, I was a new initiate. It was up to me how I wanted to go. And I was like, well, I know that these guys are not exactly what I'm looking for. So we'll try the kind of mainstream that they're bailing out of. And so I went to the section meeting as the only surviving member of either of these temples that no one else had ever spoken to because I was so new. But I knew the passwords and all that shit. And it was great because I got to meet Ian Reed. He was there, and I got to meet Nicholas Hall. And I picked up his book, Chaos and Sorcery. And I joined the IoT temple in San Francisco that was there, became a very active part of that for a year or so. And that was that whole time that I was talking about. What I found was that Nick Hall's approach, though it was much harsher than it was a lot of cursing in that book, things like that, but it was a kind of beautiful view of kind of what I think of as it was probably the first step towards what I now call dirt sorcery. Of this is actually making talismans is the main function of that book. It is well worth reading. It's available now. His take was Nick was more intense than I am on the crush them side. But and through that, I guess also I'd already found Ramsey Duke's work in 89. So this would have been 90, 91, 92, I think was the IoT period of time. And he was a big influence on me. SSOTBME was a very helpful book for me. And then I found Jan Fries. And between kind of the stuff that I got from Nick Hall and from Jan Fries, I'd found something that was really organic and kind of taking some of the technical stuff from Nick Hall as far as just like, no, actually make the thing. Actually treat it like a creature. Stuff that is very prevalent in all of my work, I think, comes from Nick Hall probably. By the time that I stepped out of the IoT, because I just didn't like the direction that they were going, my take on chaos magic had gone to a place that is very probably antithetical to where most people went with chaos magic at that point, whereas it became very what we see now, more meme driven, more anything goes driven, which is never what I got from it. What I got from it is that every magical approach that we can record has worked for the people who used it. Otherwise, it would not have survived for long enough for them to have recorded it.
Exactly.
And so if that's true, then there are perhaps rules within individual systems, particularly traditional initiatory religious systems, but we can look at all of this material as ways to work. And again, not from the sense of let's try and learn it all so we can become a particular kind of magician, but are there pieces there that kind of speak to you, right? So like if all you've ever heard is B.B. King, you may not like the blues. But if I played Junior Kimbrough or R.L. Burnside for you, you might really like the blues.
Mm.
And you can follow that chain down that rabbit hole. It's not about you have to learn the entirety of the thing. And so we formed, my friend Mark, who taught me jewelry, I was in New Orleans at the time that I left the IoT, we formed a group called the Z Cluster. And the Z Cluster was a really chaotic chaos magic thing. And we created it in a way as just as a screw you to the lodge systems, in that anyone could be affiliated, initially just by stating that they were. And then, this is back in the, I don't know if you were online in the Usenet days of alt magic and alt magic chaos. There was tons of the same thing you see on Twitter now, just with less people and more letters. Then we began being attacked for a variety of stuff, and we just didn't want to fight.
Mm.
And so we changed the bylaws because we created it, so we got to do that. So that if you ever had any contact with anyone in the Z cluster, whether you knew it or not, you were a member. And so you couldn't fight with us because you were fighting with yourself. If that's not your Z cluster, then whatever, do it different.
Mm.
So we're really just trying to be obnoxiously anti-elitist. Like, now, if you feel the need to affiliate with something, we're here. And if you've already talked to us, you have. It's just the way it goes. There's nothing you can do about it now, so just live with it. And that produced a lot of interesting stuff. And it got me into the physical talismanic silverwork, which really refined how I thought about kind of physical operative magic and creativity in magic. Because things that were technically supposed to be powerful talismans if you made them, I found to be completely inert. But doing stuff in a very raw, experimental way and playing, as we talked about earlier, produced these really crazy potent tools. And I just moved further and further into that space of, there were a few things, the things that ended up in 6 ways were kind of, in my book 6 ways, were kind of the primary keys in that opened up different kind of veins for me. That were very much, if I were to think about it in the context of what we're talking about, like each of those exercises is very much like, it's like when I found John Lee Hooker. It gave me access to something that I didn't have before. It's not that it's the best tool or that it's the best tool for everyone or that someone needs to learn everything in 6 ways. That's not the idea at all. No. It's like if you can find one way in, whether it's in this book or any book, I think you can learn everything you need to know. Because it'll show you, how do you find that? How do you tap that source? How do you know when you're on the right track without Googling it and seeing if enough people agree with you or disagree with you?
So I'm really interested in where that thing that you said about the talismans that should be effective, but they weren't. And then you did this, and that was, you found a way of working with it. What sort of thing happened that made you, go like, oh my goodness? Because often when these events happen, they're so profound, aren't they, that you sort of go, there's no denying that did that, and this, is there something you recall?
Yeah, there were a few things that I made. Okay, I know the one that's the best one for this. I needed a job when I was this is in 92, I think, maybe 93, and I was in New Orleans. And I was not having any luck finding jobs. And interviews weren't going well. If I did get interviewed, it was just not working. And so I found a palette on the side of the road, just like a wooden pallet, you know,
Yeah.
and it had been run over, and so it had been broken up. And so I took a piece of wood, you know, maybe 4 inches long and, you know, 2 or 3 inches tall, and I took it home. Um, and it was just an impulse thing, like, oh, I could use that to make something to help me
Yeah.
with what's going on. And I spent a couple days in the backyard of my little apartment. I had the bottom apartment, and I got the backyard as long as I would mow the lawn around the apartment every once in a while. Not as often as I was supposed to, but the landlord was in Denmark, so it didn't matter. No one complained. Um, and so I spent a couple of days carving that piece of wood into the form that is basically like what we would see as kind of like a Zuni bear fetish. And I don't really know why that's the thing. That's kind of the shape that I saw in the wood. And once I had carved that, as I was carving it, I kind of described this process in 6 ways. At a certain point, I began really talking to it as if it were already alive, and going, so I'm having a bunch of issues, and I could use some help resolving them, and kind of going through this whole process. And as it became more and more a bear, that's more how I was thinking of it. I was talking to it as my bear friend, whatever. And I came up with just a simple sigil. I don't remember. I remember what it looked like. And I'm pretty sure it just came from a couple of runes that seemed like they would help, that I kind of then sigilized more than a traditional binder in on the thing. To help me kind of get my income flow rolling and to help me with job stuff. And so this was a lot of work, because this was a big chunk of wood, and it was just me and a pocket knife. It wasn't any power tools to start it with or anything. I ended up with this little bear, and I remember that coming from my psychic youth stuff, you know, I spit on it and I put other bodily fluids, blood on it and things like that, and then oiled the whole thing and really began treating it as a person. I carried it in my pocket and I treated it as a person. And I would ask it about things. And if I would get the impulse, I would show it things. So if we were out and about, I remember taking it out to Audubon Park in New Orleans and introducing it to a tree that I really liked there. So this is very childlike stuff, right? The whole thing. Anyway, so this took a few days. And then I walked into a cafe near where I lived that I'd applied. I'd asked about work before, and they shut me down. And I asked if they had any openings, and the woman said, yeah, I do. And I'm actually the regional manager covering for the store manager, who's the guy who had blown me off. And if you'd like to fill out an application, I'd love to talk to you. So I'd filled one out on the spot, talked to her there. She said, great, why don't you come in tomorrow and we'll do an actual interview at our, you know, headquarters here. And we can go from there. So that was already doing way better than what I'd experienced previously. And this was a place I'd probably asked about work a couple weeks before. And so I went in and I had the bear fetish with me. And when she let me into the office and left, and I remembered I took it out and showed it the office. And I said, so the woman that sits in that chair, it would be helpful if she really liked me. I was very nervous, but I felt better because of having the bear with me. And she came in and was talking to me, and I could feel myself getting really nervous. And I was like, oh, this is why this hasn't been working well, is I'm really kind of desperate for money, and everybody can smell it. Desperation never smells good unless you're a con man, right? I do not hallucinate easily. So massive doses of LSD led to very few hallucinations in my life. And as she's talking, the bear, as an actual bear, appears behind her, behind the desk. And it's kind of making fun of her. And so I completely relax. I'm laughing with her, because this bear is actively in the space with me, and was hired on the spot.
Amazing.
And I have made versions of that bear out of pallet wood probably 5 times in the last now almost 30 years. And it's one thing, even though I don't keep the original. It's like when it's done, I bury them, let them go back. And that was probably the point where I went, this works so much better than any other piece of kind of magical technology from a grimoire or anything that I've ever seen. And that completely just, that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to go that way.
Yeah. See, there's a lot of things that resonate with how I deal with stuff in my own life, basically. One of the areas that I've always been fascinated by is how something like a piece of music can start changing your world. And there are lots of examples of that, obviously. So it's sometimes not particularly good, you know. Ones that spring to mind are John Lennon's "Happiness is a Warm Gun."
Yep.
Unfortunate, and Kurt Cobain's "Son of a Gun," as being the sort of negative ones. But from a positive point of view, I mean, there are lots of songs you could look at and think either this started the ball rolling, you know, like "All You Need Is Love," or it was literally on the rip curl, if you like, of the wave that was coming. David Bowie's "Heroes," you know, talking about Berlin Wall, and effectively, you know, in a way, it's not going to last because people's love for one another is more than the wall.
Absolutely.
And of course, the creation of those Berlin albums are steeped in interesting constructions of, you know, cut up and oblique strategy cards and all the rest of it. So I'm looking at this and thinking, well, you can see it in your own life when you write a song and your life starts to play out what you've written about. So sometimes it's a good idea to write better songs. You know.
That was my experience when I was doing the song.
And you see, the thing is, I sort of, there's a sort of a Bandler, Richard Bandler quote about, it doesn't really matter if it's real or not. Does it work? I always sort of keep that at the forefront of my mind, because you can look at this stuff and you think, oh, you know. But I always ask the question, well, why did we get children playing with toys? Because they're protective items, you know. They are
absolutely
very powerful psychological tools, if you want to put it that way, or very powerful magical tools that can protect a child. You know, it's one of the most successful ways of dealing with childhood trauma. Is to give them a teddy bear. And you think, well, we sort of know this, but we sort of then put it in a little box and think, well, we can't use that idea.
Right.
You know, but we're still the same creatures. You know, so that's why I was very interested in your early time. And really, your experiences are not that dissimilar from what your life experience is now.
No.
You know, and same with me. You know, you realise that you are the same person even now. You know, however old we are. You know, we can look back and think, well, at 7, I was thinking like this. You know, in the head of a 7-year-old, but there are similarities in the way I saw the world.
Yeah.
And I think that, for me, is an important thing for people to take. So, again, with your sort of take on magic and the fact that you don't resonate particularly with Crowley, and the way that sort of Edwardian type of thinking, which is, you know, very colonial thinking of the Golden Dawn and all the rest of it. That we had, you know, we'd stolen all that information from wherever, and it ends up in the British Museum, and they spend a lot of time there. And if it wasn't for the colonial theft of the goods from ancient cultures, they would never have had the information in the first place, you know. So
I don't know. I imagine these things move around. I've only spent time in the British Museum once, which was in 90. And when I went in 90, I had one of those just brilliant things happen, which is, you know, you roll through all this amazing Assyrian art and things like that. And I came through the hallway where they had Dee's mirror and the sigillum from his Enochian working. And I knew a ton of Enochian magicians. And when you walked out of that hallway, if you went into the space behind that hallway, that was this, I don't know if this is a permanent thing or if it's not, but it was this whole room that was a display of historical clocks and timekeepers. And I thought it was just a brilliant thing. Like, this is so much of a kind to me, right? It's like, this is this rigid, let's cut it up into pieces we can work and frame it out in this kind of mathematical precision. And I was fascinated. It was like, what a brilliant thing that all of this stuff was drawn together in this thing by people who were probably not thinking that way, but were seeing that way, right? They were feeling that way. Yeah, and it sinks into I spent a lot of time in museums kind of, once I was kind of magically aware, when I was around them, I was like hunting for what feels alive in here. And so you would find crazy things. There was a Tibetan art show in San Francisco in the 90s that had a lot of inner temple stuff. And that was a beautiful thing and incredibly potent because it was worked pieces. It wasn't, they were not neutral. They were, the spirits were very active in those pieces, but the rest of the display had related stuff. Somebody had kind of brought in related stuff. And so as I'm walking through the space, I'm kind of like doing my thing where I'm like, okay, show me the thing that's powerful in here. Show me the thing that's really live. And I found they had 3 pieces in a display, and they were from China. They were not from Tibet. And they were a dorje, a bell, and a purba that had all been machined out of high-speed steel. So this is someone using what equipment and what material they had to generate the working tools they needed. And they were crazy. Like, the power on those 3 objects were just outrageous. And yet, if you were to take this to the internet, people would tell you that this is not the right material, right? And that this was clearly built with big ass lathes. This is not handmade, and right? And yet they were, other than these tonkas from the inner temple work, easily the most potent things in there.
Amazing.
And I think that, yeah, it all sinks in. And then I do think that what you were saying about, we believe we change more than we do is what I think. And there's this, what's that thing? I don't remember. It might be the Bible, but it might not be, but about putting away childish things.
Oh, yes, right? Yes. Old Testament.
And to me, that's a terrible thing, right? You go, no, that hasn't done very well for us.
No.
And yeah, there's a great, I don't know if, are you familiar with Roland S. Howard?
With who, sorry?
Roland S. Howard?
No.
He was the guitar player for The Birthday Party, the band that Nick Cave was in before.
Right, yeah, okay, yeah.
And he has solo stuff, and he's a very Hank Marvin surf guitar taken to this really incredibly attacking aspect. Roland Howard is, but there's a beautiful documentary on him called Autoluminescent, and at one point he's being interviewed, and the interviewer asks him, he says, so there's this view that pop music, because Roland was hardcore, I'm like, I'm playing pop music. He's really into girl bands too, but he said, yeah, I'm playing pop music because, well, there's this view that pop music is very adolescent, and you can see like how Roland's hackles raise, and his response is, he goes, and basically he's like that is why it's powerful, and that has to be respected, is basically what he's saying, right? And I think that this is true about kind of the magical take that I have, or my take on music, I think, is it's it accepts that we know stuff and that we've always known stuff. And it's why I often talk about there's way less to learn about magic than there is to remember. Like it's in us.
That's a very, very good.
You know, and it's in that part of you that tends to get squished down, that you put away childish things or are forced to put away childish things. I think that that's kind of our history, though, is it's our history lived in a time where that wasn't wise. You knew what was important when you were 5 or you didn't make it to 10. So putting away childish things wasn't really a thing, right? That only makes sense in a very industrial world where we need you to be willing to suffer.
Yeah, definitely. So your 2 books, are you working on another one?
I am working on another one.
Yes, they're great books, really good. I found them thoroughly, and I read a lot of stuff, so but they were refreshingly different. And you know what you've been saying about the fact that I felt that they were the type of thing you can sort of go, the vibe of this idea is really cool, and I could do this with it, which is what you've sort of pointed out.
Absolutely.
And there are lots of things obviously I could see within there. There's a sort of, some of those practices of sort of Buddhist type, you know, feed your demons type stuff, to things that sort of Jungian type active imagination things. There are lots of things in there, and it might not be those specifically, but that, you know, I can see you're drawing a nice experience into those, and it also has got the feel about the fact that they feel as if they've been used, those ideas.
They've definitely they might have been overused from their own perspectives.
But they do really have that feel. So what have you got sort of lined up then, or is it too soon to say? Or perhaps
it's too soon to say. There's I won't say outright spirit. I would say more that there's 2 archetypes that are kind of conversing through what I'm writing right now.
Yeah.
But how that is going to play out, I don't know yet. Usually for me, the book, there's more words than the book is before I know what the book is about. And then it's a process of kind of honing down to that and filling in the spaces that need to be filled in. And so, I know it's there. I know who's talking about it, but I don't know what shape it's going to take yet.
No. But as I say, I thoroughly recommend those books to anybody who's listening. Obviously, my listenership is slightly different from a lot of the podcasts, but you know, because I'm coming obviously in from a sort of, well, in its way, it's a liminal space, because it's sort of sitting between artistic thinking and, you know, musical thinking, or, you know, magical thinking, psychological thinking, whatever. And, you know, and again, that's something that's always, it's a little bit of my character, that I'm not very good in groups of people. I can't, you know, if something's an established thing, I just sort of like to dip in and just clear off. I'm not very good at sort of hanging out.
I am not good with large groups of people. I'm not good with. I have had a few bands, and they have not lasted generally because I've gone, I have to get out of here because I can't. It's the same thing with magical groups. I can't break what I'm doing, even if what you are doing would end up with better songs. To get there. I'm not constitutionally able to do that.
Interesting.
You know,
but again, you know, similar thing. You can always trace that stuff back, can't you? Even right back to the beginning, even that type of thing, where you groups of friends, you might flit in between certain groups of people, but not hang around too long, sort of thing. Anyway, that was brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you. I thought this would be a bit of a cracker, actually.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a total pleasure.
No, it's brilliant. And as I say, you know, obviously we'll put stuff in the show notes about how people can check out what you're doing. And you've been on a lot of podcasts, so I'll try and put some stuff up of some of the podcasts you've been on, because they're always interesting.
It's one of those really odd. When I was doing the talismanic work initially, I made some very good friends, some of whom were clients and are magicians, and some who were just other practitioners that I got along with. And my friend Brianna Saucy, who's got a great book called Making Magic, which is kind of integrating folk magic into just a daily life, home life. It's one of the most accessible kind of practical books for folks that perhaps my stuff is a little too far out for. She asked me if I would teach a segment of a class she was doing with her, do it as kind of an interview, to talk about talismans. And the thing that was fascinating for me in that is I'd never done it, and I was terribly nervous going in, was my allies showed up huge. Like, they were on me and like, we want to answer that question. And I'd never had this experience at all. And so it was like, I remember like laughing and telling her like, if you're cool with me channeling, which I didn't know I do, I'm going to be doing that. And she's like, go for it. But I found that the process of talking to people who are good, like you are, or Dara, or Doug at What Magic Is It, or Alex at the Glitch Bottle, things like that, and most of the folks that I've talked to are very good, is it helps bring things to clarity for me to be involved in the conversations. Again, because I'm very reclusive, and most of the stuff that goes on online is just in sound bites, snippets.
Yeah.
And so I really love the process. It's very helpful to me creatively. A lot of stuff that has come out in the podcasts has or will make it into books, because there's things that I don't necessarily piece together in the same way until it's drawn out, and then it kind of pops and you go, oh yeah, that's really a relevant thing, It's funny. It's like one of the things that Six Ways did is I was kind of on a rampage to like get the musical references out of there. And then one of my allies was like, dude, this is just you. Just leave it. It's fine. And that actually connected a huge ton of people to me. They were like, okay, I can relate to this guy. This guy was into Motorhead and Judas Priest, Billy Idol. I can talk to this guy about this thing that's been going on with me for 20 years. Too intimidated to talk to other people about, So I love the whole process.
That's brilliant. Well, all the very best for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me. It was a great pleasure.
It was lovely. And hopefully I'll do this again at some point.
Absolutely. I'm always game.
Yeah, cool. That's good stuff. So thanks ever so much. And
thank you.
All the best.
Take care.
Well, that was a blast. I really enjoyed that. You need to check out Aidan's books, Six Ways and Weaving Fate. And he's got a podcast as well. And all that stuff will be in the show notes. So check out my Patreon if you want to get some information about playing the guitar and all the rest of the stuff that we do. And until next time, I'll see you then. Bye.